Welcome to this AI debate on men's rights movement, addressing real issues or misogyny, where chatbots explore both sides. We'll begin with opening statements from Legitimate-Grievances and Misogyny-Driven. Now, Legitimate-Grievances.
Imagine a father who wants shared custody but faces procedures that feel opaque and tilted against his role as a parent, a teenager who will not ask for help when depressed, and a worker sent into a high-risk job without adequate protections. These individual stories add up to systemic patterns that deserve our attention. I stand here to argue that the men's rights movement, at its core, draws attention to real, measurable gaps affecting men and boys, and that those gaps merit policy attention and social support rather than wholesale dismissal. First, on mental health and suicide. Evidence indicates that men account for a large share of suicide deaths worldwide, and that social norms about masculinity, combined with barriers to help-seeking, contribute to unmet need for mental health care. This matters because preventable loss of life and untreated illness inflict immense harm on families and communities, and because targeted outreach can change outcomes when it is designed to meet men where they are. Second, on workplace safety. Occupational fatalities and many severe injuries are concentrated in male-dominated industries, which produces a persistent sex gap in workplace death and disability, and calls for stronger gender-informed safety policy, enforcement, and training. Those are not abstract statistics. They describe parents, partners, and colleagues whose absence reverberates through households and local economies. Third, family law and custody. While laws increasingly endorse shared parenting in principle, practical outcomes often leave non-resident fathers with reduced parenting time and unclear enforcement of support and access, creating social and psychological costs for children and adults that merit procedural reform and better support for cooperative parenting arrangements. Fourth, education. In many OECD education systems, boys underperform girls in early reading, and in some places lag in tertiary enrollment, signaling the need for gender-responsive pedagogies, early literacy interventions tailored to boys' learning trajectories, and policies that respond to changing patterns of attainment rather than assuming a single-sex solution. Fifth, healthcare and research gaps. Patterns of help-seeking, screening, and research attention sometimes overlook male-specific pathways to disease and prevention, and the scientific community has recognized the need to consider sex as a biological variable to improve diagnosis and treatment for everyone. Those shortfalls translate into worse outcomes for particular conditions and missed opportunities for public health intervention. Now, to be clear and direct, the men's rights movement is heterogeneous. Many advocates press evidence-based claims about mental health services, workplace safety, custody fairness, education, and health research. A minority, meanwhile, deploy harassment, vitriol, and even threats online and offline, and that behavior must be condemned in the strongest terms. Condemning harassment does not require us to throw out legitimate grievances. Rather, it requires us to separate reformist advocacy from extremist tactics so we can work with those who want constructive solutions. The policy remedies I propose are straightforward and practical. Expand and tailor mental health outreach that addresses masculine norms and improves access points for men and boys, including community-based programs and primary care screening informed by what the evidence shows about help-seeking patterns. Strengthen occupational safety standards, enforce labor protections in high-risk sectors, and invest in training and engineering controls where fatality rates remain disproportionately male. Reform family court procedures to make shared parenting presumptions meaningful in practice through clearer standards, better mediation resources, and support for cooperative custody arrangements that serve children's interests. Implement educational interventions that target early literacy gaps, re-examine classroom practices that may disadvantage boys, and monitor tertiary enrollment trends so that policy responds to both boys' and girls' needs. Finally, direct research funding to understudied male health pathways and ensure clinical research routinely considers sex differences so treatments are genuinely effective for everyone. Critics will rightly point to misogynistic actors who exploit grievances for anti-women rhetoric. We must call out and isolate those actors while affirming that evidence-based pro-equality advocacy for men and boys can complement, not contradict women's rights. Building coalitions with gender equity organizations, public health agencies, labor regulators, and child welfare advocates will produce more durable solutions than shutting down conversation outright. In short, when data reveal differential harms or service gaps affecting men and boys, pragmatic, evidence-led policies, improved mental health outreach, stronger workplace protections, family law refinements, targeted educational strategies, and dedicated health research will reduce suffering and strengthen families and communities. Rejecting harassment and misogyny is essential. Throwing out legitimate grievances with the bad actors who sometimes claim them would be a policy error. The sensible path is to separate the messengers from the message where necessary and to work across movements to close real gaps wherever the evidence shows they exist.
Now, misogyny-driven.
In 2014, a high-profile online harassment campaign made clear how quickly anger directed at women can scale into coordinated abuse and doxing, a pattern that reappears in complaints and tactics tied to parts of the men's rights movement. My position is straightforward. While some individuals within the broader movement raise legitimate concerns about men's well-being, large swaths of the men's rights movement function as an anti-feminist reaction that routinely scapegoats women, amplifies harassment, and distorts evidence in ways that actively undermine gender equity. The reason this matters is not ideological sophistry, it is practical and proximate. When groups build narratives that cast women and feminism as the primary cause of men's problems, they divert attention from structural policy solutions toward blame, and they normalize harassment as a political tactic. Evidence indicates that rhetoric framing feminism as the root of male disadvantage repeatedly appears across prominent MRM platforms and public messaging, converting social grievance into targeted hostility. That rhetorical pattern is not neutral language. It shifts political energy away from investments in mental health services, poverty reduction, and family policy toward punitive, zero-sum cultural fights. Second, the movement's public impact cannot be separated from the online harm it helps produce. Parts of the movement have given rise to, or amplified, organized campaigns of harassment, doxing, and intimidation, using playbooks identical to earlier misogynistic backlash episodes that sought to silence women and marginalized voices. These tactics are not occasional excesses. They are recurring features of the environment in which some self-identified MRM actors operate, and they have material consequences. Targeted harassment drives people offline, discourages reporting, and impedes the civic participation of survivors and advocates. Third, the evidence shows that many high-profile MRM arguments rest on selective anecdote and statistical cherry-picking rather than rigorous analysis. Individual stories of hardship are treated as evidence of a crisis inflicted by feminism, while well-documented patterns of gendered harm, including higher rates of intimate partner violence and the unequal burden of reproductive labor on women, are minimized or ignored. This selective approach to data is misleading because it erases context. It fails to account for power imbalances, the cumulative impact of social institutions, and the way gender interacts with race, class, and other structures. If we accept those distorted claims at face value, policy responses will be correspondingly brittle and misdirected. Fourth, tolerating and legitimizing the movement's dominant narratives risks concrete rollback on hard-won protections. When the public conversation normalizes skepticism of survivors, questions the legitimacy of gender equity measures, or frames reproductive and workplace rights as special privileges harming men, political actors gain cover to pursue regressive policy changes. That process is not hypothetical. Pattern analyses of online backlash against gender equality initiatives show how coordinated campaigns can create political pressure that slows reforms and chills support for survivors. Fifth, the best response to genuine problems facing men is not to blame women, but to invest in inclusive, evidence-based policies. Programs that expand men's access to mental health care, improve social supports for fathers and caregivers, reform family courts with an emphasis on fairness, and target economic insecurity will actually reduce many of the harms MRM rhetoric claims to address, and they do so without treating women as the enemy. These are policy choices grounded in empirical prevention and support, not scapegoating. The The predictable counterargument is that only a fringe within the movement is overtly misogynistic, and that condemning the whole group is unfair. That objection underestimates the diffuse power of misogynistic currents. Even when extreme actors are a minority, their tactics, memes, and talking points spread across forums and social platforms, shaping public discourse and enabling harassment at scale. Tolerating the movement's platforms without consequences therefore risks normalizing harassment and emboldening political actors who respond to anti-women narratives. Finally, let me be absolutely clear. This critique is not a denial that men face real, sometimes urgent problems. We must acknowledge those problems and respond with generosity and seriousness. But organizing around routines of blaming women, amplifying doxing and intimidation, and misusing statistics to erase documented harms is not the constructive route. The task before us is to support policies and movements that take men's needs seriously while upholding gender equity and protecting the vulnerable, to invest in services, reform institutions, and build inclusive public conversations rather than scapegoating, silencing, or attacking those who already bear disproportionate burdens. In short, confronting the harms that the men's rights movement in many of its public forms perpetuates is integral to preserving an equitable society where both men and women can flourish. We should respond with policy, not persecution, with evidence, not erasure, and with solidarity, not scapegoating.
Now, let's hear the first rebuttals from Legitimate-Grievances and Misogyny-Driven. Now, Legitimate-Grievances.
I agree with the core of what they just said. Coordinated online harassment and intimidation tied to parts of the men's rights movement are real, harmful, and deserve unequivocal condemnation. That acknowledgement matters because it removes the easy rhetorical dodge of saying anyone who raises men's issues is automatically beyond the pale. The real question is whether the existence of toxic fringes should make us ignore patterns of measurable disadvantage affecting men and boys. And it should not. Far from proving that the entire conversation is illegitimate, the presence of bad actors argues for clearer, evidence-based advocacy, better messaging, and stronger partnerships with organizations committed to equality. My opponents emphasize misuse of statistics and scapegoating. I welcome that scrutiny. Anecdote and anger have no place in policy, but they also conceded that men face real problems. If we accept that premise, we must be honest about what follows. Higher rates of male suicide and underuse of mental health services, concentration of men in high-risk occupations with higher workplace fatality rates, predictable friction and perceived bias in some family court processes, gaps in boys' educational outcomes in particular settings, and underinvestment in male-specific health research are policy problems, not propaganda. Dismissing those issues because some people weaponize grievance is like refusing to fix a leaking roof because a few roofers behave badly. What I propose is practical and non-zero sum. Expand male-tailored mental health outreach and crisis services that lower barriers to help seeking. Design parental leave policies and family law reforms that support shared parenting and transparent decision-making. Target workplace safety improvements and enforcement where fatality risks are highest. Pilot school interventions that support boys' literacy and engagement, and fund research into male-predominant health conditions so care is evidence-based. These are programmatic fixes, each amenable to piloting, evaluation, and adjustment. When opponents point to harassment, I say this: separate the deeds from the demands, condemn the harassment, sanction the abusers, and at the same time test policies that save lives, strengthen families, and raise educational outcomes. Better still, build coalitions. Women's rights groups, labor organizations, public health agencies, and fatherhood advocates share large common ground on mental health, violence prevention, family stability, and economic security. If our aim is fewer deaths, healthier children, and safer workplaces, the right question is not which side wins, but which interventions demonstrably work. We should refuse false moral exclusions and choose evidence, partnership, and practical remedies instead.
Now, Misogyny-Driven.
You began from the right place. Men do face measurable problems: suicide, workplace fatalities, custody frustrations, gaps in health research, and those deserve serious nonpartisan solutions. I accept that premise, and I start there because agreement on the facts of human suffering is where constructive policy begins. The real disagreement is about what explains those problems and how public rhetoric frames them. The men's rights movement too often converts legitimate grievances into a simple, zero-sum story. Feminism and women are presented as the primary cause of men's harm. That framing matters because it redirects attention from structural explanations, occupational segregation, underinvestment in mental health services, poverty, racialized policing, and social isolation, toward scapegoating. It's easy to point to an anecdote and declare causation. It's harder to produce careful comparative analyses that control for class, race, and access to services. Those methodological gaps are not incidental. They're the mechanism by which some advocates turn data into a political weapon rather than a tool for policy design. Equally important is how rhetoric scales into action. When public messaging repeatedly casts women or feminism as the enemy, online mobilization moves swiftly from argument to harassment. Doxing, coordinated attacks, and intimidation campaigns silence survivors and discourage reporting. Whether we call these behaviors fringes or symptoms, their public visibility changes the incentives of political life. Journalists, activists, and ordinary people are less likely to speak up when the cost is targeted abuse. Your insistence that harassment is only a minority problem is politically relevant. If movement leaders or platforms tolerate and amplify such tactics, the minority becomes a public effect. On substance, some common MRM moves deserve scrutiny. Selective statistics and anecdote are treated as proof, while inconvenient context is ignored. Higher male suicide rates do not automatically indict feminism. Custody outcomes reflect legal practices, enforcement, and economic power more than a single ideological culprit. Occupational deaths reflect who is sent into harm's way, not a gender conspiracy. If we want durable solutions, we must untether policy from scapegoating, invest in universal mental health access, redesign workplace safety with sectoral data, fund trauma-informed mediation and meaningful shared parenting supports, and direct research funding to sex-informed medicine, all pursued within intersectional, gender-equitable coalitions that refuse to normalize blame. Allowing a movement whose public rhetoric frequently delegitimizes women's experiences to set the terms of reform risks rolling back reproductive rights, workplace equity, and protections for survivors. The pragmatic path is to embrace men's needs without scapegoating women, build coalitions, demand rigorous evidence, and isolate platforms and leaders who traffic in harassment. That keeps the focus where it should be, reducing harm and strengthening families and communities rather than fueling a politics of backlash.
Moving on to the second rebuttals. Now, legitimate grievances.
I'll begin where we already agree. Organized online harassment and coordinated intimidation tied to parts of the men's rights movement are real, harmful, and require unequivocal condemnation. Acknowledging that saves us from the lazy move of throwing the whole conversation away. My opponent's strongest point is already theirs, that some actors convert grievance into scapegoating, and I accept it without qualification. Now let's be clear about what follows from that concession. Accepting that a subset behaves abusively does not erase the lived, measurable problems affecting many men and boys. When members of your community are dying by suicide at higher rates, entering the most dangerous jobs at disproportionate rates, struggling with mental health help-seeking, navigating family courts that often leave them feeling excluded, or exhibiting worrying educational underachievement in certain contexts, those are policy problems, not rhetorical victories for any movement. The proper response to toxic rhetoric is not to silence evidence, it is to sharpen evidence and tighten accountability. If you worry about scapegoating, the antidote is rigorous pilots, transparent evaluation, and coalitions that include women's rights groups, labor unions, public health agencies, and fatherhood organizations. Don't make me defend the indefensible. Harassment must be isolated, prosecuted, and platform practices changed. But do ask yourself this next question. If an intervention demonstrably reduces suicides, improves child well-being through shared parenting, or cuts workplace fatalities, would you oppose it because some online users said ugly things about women? If your answer is yes, you need to show empirical grounds, not moral outrage. If your answer is no, then our disagreement is rhetorical, not substantive. On policy, the agenda I advance is deliberately non-zero sum. Expand and reframe mental health outreach to lower barriers men face in help seeking. Design parental leave and family law reforms that make joint caregiving practical and measured. Target workplace safety enforcement to high-risk sectors and invest in safer technology. Pilot school programs that re-engage boys early and fund sex-informed health research where gaps exist. Each proposal can be trialed, evaluated, and scaled only if we remove politics from the pilot room. If you believe these measures will harm women's rights, name the mechanism and the evidence. If you cannot, your stance risks becoming rhetorical protectionism rather than principled critique. Finally, let's reframe this debate around outcomes. Fewer deaths, healthier families, safer workplaces. I will spend my closing showing how evidence-first, accountable, and coalition-driven reforms achieve those outcomes. The burden on skeptics is to explain which specific evidence-based remedies they would reject and why.
Now, misogyny-driven.
I appreciate the concession that men face real, measurable problems: higher suicide rates, dangerous workplace exposures, custody frustrations, and gaps in male-specific health research. That shared ground is where practical policy must begin. My point is narrower and strategic. Acknowledging problems is not the same as endorsing a public movement that repeatedly frames those problems as women's fault. When the argument's center is, feminism did this to men, questions of causation are skipped and context is erased. Which is more convincing? A careful comparative analysis that controls for class, race, occupation, and service access, or a tally of anecdotes that point a finger at a political opponent? I ask my opponent directly, can they identify rigorous, peer-reviewed work that treats feminism as the causal variable for the harms they list, rather than selective correlation? If not, we cannot accept sweeping policy prescriptions built on omission rather than evidence. Method matters. Cherry-picked statistics and singular stories can mobilize anger. They do not substitute for diagnosis. That matters because rhetoric shapes behavior. When leaders or platforms cultivate a narrative that positions women and gender equity efforts as the enemy, it becomes a vector for coordinated abuse, doxing, brigading, harassment, and threats that drive survivors and witnesses offline. If you believe harassment is only a fringe problem, then answer this. Will you publicly disavow and cut ties with figures and platforms that normalize intimidation? Tolerating them makes the fringe a tolerated instrument of political pressure. Now to what we can all support. I concede the practical agenda you outlined. More mental health outreach targeted to men, stronger enforcement of workplace safety where risks are concentrated, custody reforms that lower barriers to shared parenting, and funding for sex-aware medical research is sensible and necessary. But these interventions work best inside intersectional coalitions that refuse to scapegoat. Frame programs as strengthening families and communities, not as a counterattack on women's rights. Invest in universal access to crisis services, OSHA enforcement targeted by sector, trauma-informed custody mediation, and school programs that engage boys without stereotyping them. That defeats the political monopoly of reactionary voices. Finally, the question that will shape my closing: will you separate the policy from the platforms? If your answers are tentative, then your program risks legitimizing harassment and rolling back protections for survivors. If your answers are firm, then join me in building evidence-based, gender-equitable coalitions, because we can save lives and strengthen families only when we refuse both scapegoating and silence.
Finally, the closing statements from both sides. Now, legitimate grievances.
Think of the father who wants shared custody but meets opaque procedures, the teen who hides his depression, the worker sent into a hazardous shift without proper protections. Those are not abstractions. They're patterns we've acknowledged in this debate. My opponents and I agree the harms exist. What divides us is what we do next. The men's rights movement, at its core, has pulled attention to measurable gaps. Mental health outreach that misses men, higher male suicide and workplace fatality rates, lopsided family court outcomes, and holes in male-focused health research. Naming problems is only useful if it leads to policy. Targeted mental health services, sensible paternal leave and family law reform, tougher workplace safety enforcement, and funding for male-specific medical study. These are practical, pro-evidence steps. We must also be clear-eyed. Harassment and violent rhetoric from some actors are unacceptable and must be repudiated. But throwing the entire conversation away because of bad actors would leave real suffering unaddressed. The wiser path is coalition, men's advocates working with gender equity groups to solve shared problems. If our goal is fair, healthier lives for everyone, then focusing on men's needs is not opposition to equality, it is part of it.
Now, misogyny-driven.
We began by agreeing that men face real urgent problems: suicide, dangerous jobs, custody frustrations, and I reaffirmed that those deserve serious policy solutions. But throughout this debate, the pattern has been clear. Too much of the men's rights movement does not simply advocate, it scapegoats feminism, minimizes survivors, and traffics in coordinated harassment that silences women and marginalized people. When rhetoric excuses perpetrators, when doxing and online mobs follow, the public effect is not debate, but suppression. Their selective use of anecdotes and statistics erases structural power imbalances and the documented harms women continue to suffer. And that distortion has real social costs: rolling back reproductive rights, undermining workplace equity, normalizing misogyny. The answer is not to tolerate a movement whose currents feed harassment. It is to meet men's needs through inclusive, intersectional policies, mental health investment, family services, fair custody reform, without scapegoating women. If we care about justice for everyone, we must reject narratives that trade compassion for blame.